So, I found one of these books incredibly disappointing and it did not meet my expectations at all. So, if you'd like me to go on a small rant about a book, then you're in the right place. So, come and join me in this video. Welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name is Mal and I like to review books. So today's video is my weekly review video where I review all of the books that I've read in the last week, and we have just started a new month, which means we have a new reading prompt. So this month I'm doing K is May, which means I can read any book from an author who has a forename or a surname beginning with a K. Now the reason I'm doing this challenge is I want to be able to read some Stephen King and some Barbara Kingsolve this month. But actually, when I was looking at my collection on my TBR pile, there are so many authors that have K in the forename or the surname. So I thought this is going to be a relatively open challenge and I should be able to read across many different genres and many different authors. So as you've seen in the intro to this video, I have started or read 3 books this week. So I finished 2 completely and then I'm partially through another book. So I'm going to start with the one that hasn't disappointed me. So it's probably going to surprise you because going through the reviews on Goodreads, I think a lot of people probably think I'm going to have a rant about this one, The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. But that is not the case at all. So this is the second book that I've started to read this month. And I have actually finished this book and I thought it was absolutely fantastic. So this was published in 2021, so it's not particularly old to be honest, although I don't really see many people talking about this one, but it is in the historical fiction genre, which Kristen Hanna writes so well in. So this one, it kind of starts just after the Great War, so just before 1920, and we have our character Elsa, and she's just coming of age, like as a young woman, and she's living in, I think it's Dalhart, Texas, which is in an area known as the Dust Bowl in America. And she lives, she is sort of from a what you'd sort of class as middle class, I guess. So her family owned land, but they don't farm the land, from what I can tell. They sort of take tariffs from people that farm their land. So she comes from a well-to-do background. Anyway, circumstances happen where essentially her parents reject her and she ends up having a child. And so she's not having that child out of wedlock. She ends up having to marry a man and she moves in with him on his farm with his family. So we then sort of cut to the 1930s, and this is roughly like her eldest child is about 13 years old and the youngest child is probably about 7 years old. So in this time she has basically started to learn how to run a household and how to work on the farm, and her life has completely changed and the people in her life have completely changed, and she has adapted to these changes really well. And we, as I say, we now set most of the story is in the decade of the 1930s, and what's sort of happening in this time is you have the Great Depression happening in America, and you also have all these massive like dust storms going across basically the area known as the Dust Bowl. And this was kind of considered to be because the way that farmers had been farming the land was not sort of helpful to it to sort of preserve it. So basically all the topsoil of the land was getting blown absolutely everywhere, and this was causing massive problems. There was also lots of droughts in these years, so nothing was growing either, so it was completely dry, there was no water, no rain. Animals were just starving as they stood in the fields because they just didn't have anything to eat, and the people had to really try to adapt to survive in these really harsh conditions. Anyway, Elsa and her children end up going on a migration, and they try to migrate to California and they try to make a life for themselves there. And it's really interesting. I always think that Kristen Hanna always puts a lot of research into her books, because she seems to describe everything really well, to the point where you feel like you could be standing there and you feel like you can close your eyes and imagine that you're in the scene, like in the picture that she has sort of painted. And when our characters are back in Dalhart, Texas, she paints this picture of this really unforgiving landscape, and it's really harsh. And our character Elsa has had a pretty hard life as well, and that's sort of reflected really well in the landscape. Now she wants her children to do better than she has done, which I think all parents, aspire to have their children do better than what they have done. And what Elsa really, really wanted was for her children to grow up knowing a home, and that the farm that they're on, like, to preserve that land for all the generations that were going to come after her. But she kind of has to forego that dream a bit, obviously, because they have to survive. And there was this massive migration of people basically coming out of the Dust Bowl, going towards California. um, so we Christian Hannah like paints this journey really well as well, like their migration, and who they met along the way, and sort of what dangers they were in, and like what was sort of happening to them. And then the rest of the book is sort of where they're in California, and they are economic migrants basically, and they're trying to make that work. And then there's all the prejudices against them for being migrants, and it's just really, really difficult for them to climb out of the hole of poverty that they now find themselves in. So this book is like, you know I don't really know how to say it. Like, for me, I just thought I was hooked from the very start. I really liked Elsa's character. I read a couple of people online really didn't like Elsa's character, but I actually really did like her. She's flawed, in some respects, but she's a really wholesome person, I think, and she's a really honest person, and that's what I like about her. And she goes through so much suffering in this book, and it's just heartbreaking as you're reading it. And then obviously she has her children and the rest of her family as well, and we're sort of rooting for them and everything that that they're going through. And she always just has this habit of sort of making you want to cry multiple times while you're reading a book, and that's how I felt with this book. I was so invested in all of the characters, and the ending was a really, really good ending. I'm not going to say too much about the ending because I don't obviously want to give that away if people want to read it. But as always, it kind of like just smashes you in the heart. And I thought this was absolutely fantastic. Now, the reason why I felt like people might think that this is the book that I want to rant about is obviously after I read it, I went on to Goodreads. I wanted to find out what other people think of it. As you do, I think lots of people do that. And I saw a lot of people scoring this book down and saying that it was a celebration of communism. And I kept seeing this comment over and over and over again. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. So, communism is mentioned in this book. There is basically the Communist Party trying to get a foothold in California, where our economic migrants have gone. Now, I think that that's perfectly realistic for that to be written into the novel. You have all of these economic migrants, and they're all being sort of taken advantage of for minimum wage, well, less than minimum wage. It wasn't even a minimum wage set then. And then because of that, the local people as well are then expected to work for a really, really low wage. So this would seem like a prime area where you would basically have workers' parties come in and try to organise and unionise, the local workers. So for that, I don't think that this book is celebrating communism at all. I think that it's quite realistic to depict what those kind of parties would have been doing and how they would have been canvassing at that time to try and get their support. And I also think, whether or not people like it, different political viewpoints exist in this world. And there are people who want to vote for communism or socialism or any of those parties. And there's normally a reason why people vote for the political party that they're going to vote for. So I think all that Christian Hannah has done in this book is she has created a character, and she has put them into a life situation where that kind of political leaning might appeal to that person, and that they might be interested in communism. So I don't think that this is a celebration of communism at all. I do not think that Kristen Hanna has basically said, everybody, go and vote communism, or I agree with communism. There is nothing like that in this book at all, from what I can see. All I can see is that she has developed a character who goes through several hardships and finds herself in certain situations where the Communist Party and what they stand for are most applicable to that character at that time. and that character is exploring that. I don't see that there's anything wrong with that at all. So I'm really, really interested in all those comments on Goodreads where people seem to be really upset about the fact that, you know, there was a communist character in this book and the Communist Party sort of featured in here somehow. So I thought that it was perfectly within place, within the setting and the time in this book and what our character was going through. So I would definitely rate this book a 5 star. I really, really enjoyed it. So I think that's a good start to the month. However, this is not the first book that I read for Kate is May. This is actually the second one. I just wanted to start with the positives first and how much I enjoyed this book. So the first book that I actually read this month, which I really didn't enjoy as much as I thought I would, was The Phoenix Pencil Company by Alison King. Now, this was published at the back end of last year in 2025, and I read the synopsis for it, and I was like, I'm sold. I will really, really enjoy that book. I thought it looked absolutely fantastic. So, basically, the general gist of this book is that in Shanghai, there is a company called the Phoenix Pencil Company, and it's a family run company, and they make pencils, and the lead in those pencils can be removed, like the heart of the pencil can be removed from the casing of the pencil, and whatever was written with that pencil can be extracted from it. So you can basically have the stories that were written with those pencils extracted from those pencils. Now, I thought that that sounded like an absolutely brilliant idea. I mean, the concept for that in a book is just great because you could think about all the different things that you could do with it and all the different, you know, nefarious things that could be done if somebody had that talent, all of the amazing things that could be done. You know, you could think like, oh, there could be love stories coming out of these pencils, there could be people's wills coming out of these pencils, there could be, you know, great academic findings written with these pencils. There could have been messages for war written with these pencils. I mean, there are just so many things that could have been written with these pencils that would have been interesting if they were uncovered. So obviously, this book is going to be in the realm of fantasy slightly, but it's sort of like, I would say, a little bit fantasy historical fiction. So this book is set in 2 time zones. So set in, I think it's about 2018 in the present, with the younger granddaughter, and she's living with her grandmother, and they are living in America. But her grandmother has migrated over, like emigrated over from Shanghai when she was a young woman. Um, so the story is sort of written in diary entries. So we have diary entries that are written on a computer by our young granddaughter, and then we have a letter which is sort of documenting life back in Shanghai, written by the grandmother. And the grandmother's writing it with the pencils that the pencil company used to make, and the granddaughter, as I said, is using a computer to write her entries. And what they're doing is that the granddaughter is basically working for some project which is creating an application which can help bring people together and, like, you know, scrape the internet for information and, you know, bring people together. And she has managed to find the cousin of her grandmother, and the cousin of her grandmother is still back in Shanghai. So the letter that her grandmother is writing is to her cousin in Shanghai, and they've not spoken to each other for many, many, many decades. So in the letters that the grandmother is writing, we're set back in the 1930s to begin with, and then we sort of hedge into the 1940s, where they used to live in the international settlement in Shanghai. And we follow our character through sort of, there's the, well, World War II is sort of going on obviously at this time, and then we have the Japanese occupation as well, and when the British disappear as well. So there's quite a few things going on in China, and then there's obviously the fight between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party. So there's absolute political turmoil and upheaval going on, and this is, you know, really interesting reading the grandmother's diary entries. And I would say that this is, well, letter. And I would say that this is my favourite part of the book. I really, really enjoyed those because they were really insightful and really gave, you know, a good idea of what the population might have been going through at that time and how our characters survived that. And also with the talent that our character has for extracting information out of pencils, how she was sort of utilised by different governing bodies or anti-governing bodies, like you could say, during that time. So I did really, really enjoy that. And I really wish that the book had basically focused on the grandmother's letters to her cousin, and then maybe if the cousin had written letters coming back the other way, so that we could have basically just kept the whole story sort of from the present, reminiscing back on the past. I think that that would have been the most interesting for me. But obviously, that wasn't the case. Our granddaughter, Monica, in her diary entries, she's obviously talking about this application that she's trying to create. And Alison King herself is a software engineer, as I understand. So our main character, Monica, is also a software engineer, and we see that brought in quite a lot. She's discussing many sort of tech terms. There's actually a really, really good example in here where she's explaining Git rebasing to another character. And I think she does that really well. And as someone who works in IT myself, I did actually quite enjoy that. I thought that was quite good. But I felt that there was too much of it. I felt like it was irrelevant that our character was creating or involved in creating this communication app. I didn't really care about the app, and I'm not really sure like what it brought to the story. And essentially, I also don't really understand. Our character was very involved with her work, and keen to explain to this other woman that she's trying to impress, things, as I said, about Git rebasing and technical terms, basically. And I just thought it was irrelevant, it was not wanted. There's also a kind of love interest going on in here between Monica and this other woman, as she's sort of finding out that she, prefers women. And again, I felt that that was just sort of a diversion from the actual story that you wanted to read. Like, I didn't really think that we needed Monica's involvement with her job or her involvement with this other person. I think that this other person didn't even really need to be in this story, to be honest. So I didn't really enjoy Monica's diary entries because I was only really enjoying it when I was reading the grandmother's letter, and then when I'd have to go back into Monica's diary entries, I'd be like looking at how many pages there would be for that just so I could get past it, because I was like, it's not really bringing anything to the story. Now, I this may be a little bit of a spoiler in this book, but it's difficult for me to say how unhappy I am with this aspect of it without going into a bit of detail. So you might want to just skip through the video until you see me holding up Stephen King, The Regulators, if you don't want any spoilers. But essentially, in order to get the information out of the pencils, the characters have to go through this really convoluted, complicated method where apparently they have to stab themselves in the wrist. And then by stabbing themselves in the wrist, they absorb the story from the pencil. And then in order to, well, they call it reforging, but it's to get this message to come back out of their body, they then have to get a knife and cut themselves and bleed the message back out onto the page. And then after they've done that once, they somehow end up with some scarified phoenix image on their arm. I don't know how that shows up at all. Like, I don't know where it comes from. It just comes from the first time that they do it. And then when they do this process more and more, then this phoenix becomes more and more pronounced. First off, I don't understand why we have to necessarily bleed the message back out on the page. Like, both sides of this, like actually absorbing the message and then getting the message out of you, seem very, very violent, and it seemed like really needless to be that violent. I don't understand, and why it had to be like that. And through parts of the book where the grandmother and her cousin are like doing this reforging over and over again, these people just keep constantly carrying out this violent act on themselves, and nobody really seems to be that bothered by it. And it also made me wonder, like, how did anybody even discover that that was the way to reforge a pencil? I have no idea. And that's never explained in the book. It's never explained if anybody else in the world has this talent, or just the grandmother and her cousin and the members of their family, how that was even discovered. There is no There's no explanation for any of that. And I felt like the actual getting the information out of the pencil was just, I thought it could have been done so much better. But then to add on to it, there is a secondary way that our characters can reforge the information that they've pushed into themselves with the pencil lead, and they could have an orgasm instead of cutting themselves. Now, I don't understand how having an orgasm is the same as bleeding out onto the paper, because bleeding out onto the paper makes the words appear on the paper. But to have an orgasm, how is that coming out onto any paper then? Like, I don't understand it. It was just absolutely nuts. And then there's a scene that just really, really annoys me when the grandmother is trying to teach our young granddaughter Monica like how to reforge, and she doesn't want her to cut herself, so she wants her to do it via orgasm. So she basically gets her to stab herself with a pencil, and then says, "Oh yeah, you're gonna have to have an orgasm if you want to reforge that." And our character Monica's never had an orgasm before, so she's like held hostage to have her first orgasm because her grandmother has made her to, and then she's having an orgasm, but she has to think, that's interrupted with the message that her grandmother has shoved into her arm. I mean, there's just something that's so sick and wrong about that. I don't even know why this wasn't questioned when people were editing this book. I don't know. But it doesn't make sense how bleeding out of your arm is the equivalent to having an orgasm. And then why would you want to reforge messages by having an orgasm? Like, you know, do you want to be thinking about other people's messages that they've written in pencils that you might not know what they are while you're at the peak of ecstasy with your partner? I don't know. None of that makes any sense to me. It just seemed really contrived, and I just hated it. I really just hated that aspect of it. I really felt that we really needed to think and consider, actually, the idea of being able to get messages out of a pencil, like what had been previously written for, is a really, really, really good idea. But the way that it was executed was just really bad from my side. I did not enjoy it at all, and I'm just sort of like intrigued, like how anybody else could really sort of enjoy it. I think the writer did herself a disservice. I think that the book could have been a lot better if she'd really sat and considered how to reforge pencils in a way that A, wasn't so violent, and B, didn't require an orgasm. Um, and yeah, I'm going to rate this a 2, and I feel like that's being generous. And when I first finished reading it, I thought maybe I'll give it a 2.5 or 2.75. And the more I think about it, I'm like, no, there are too many questions that are not answered in this book. As I said, one, why did we have to go down the orgasm route and the cutting ourselves route? There was no need for it. It was glorifying self harm. I had a go about B. Schwab doing that in what was it called? It was a book I read a few months ago. Not the color of magic. Like, anyway, I can't remember. I'll put the book up on the screen. But basically, I had a problem with it because I felt like it was glorifying self harm for no reason, and I feel like this book is doing the same thing. And then, as I say, the alternative is not great either. But then there's all these questions about, what a great talent to have. How did this, come about in your family? How many generations of your family have done this? Could we know more history about that? So I felt like the modern day conversation with the granddaughter, to do with the technology and the IT and her love interest in this other woman, I felt like that was sort of getting in the way of the story. Then there was, like, the reforging bit, which could have been interesting but was just executed really, really badly. So the only thing I was really left with in this book enjoying was the grandmother's letter to her cousin. And I just kind of wished that the book had more gone down that route and investigated the history of this talent in that family, and all the different things it could have been used for, possibly over the centuries. So yeah, really not happy with this book, and it's a shame as well because I had such high hopes for it when I read the synopsis. I even went out and bought the hardback because I thought I'm definitely going to like this, and I'll say it was just a huge, huge disappointment. So yeah, if you have read this yourself, let me know what you think in the comments down below. So after I finished those two, I had a little bit of time to pick up a third book, and I thought I definitely wanted to pick up a Stephen King. So I picked up The Regulators. Now, it's funny really because this is Kay's May and he wrote this under the name, the Richard Bachman name, but we all know it was Stephen King, so that's fine. Now, I'm about a quarter of the way through this. I'm about 125 pages, and I think this is about 440 roundabouts. And it was a little bit difficult to get into. Like, it started off really violently, but I was trying to understand, like, all of the characters. I mean, within the first 5 pages, I feel like you're introduced to about 15 characters. So that was all really, really confusing. And there's a couple of like postcards and sort of letters, notes that are sort of put in right at the beginning. They didn't really make much sense to me to begin with. And then it got to about page 80 and it mentioned Desperation, the town Desperation. And I remembered, I was like, oh, there is a Stephen King book where you need to read it in tandem with one of the others that he's written, which is basically Desperation, this one. So I checked online and, asked, should I read Desperation first or The Regulators? And obviously I was hoping that it would come back with The Regulators because that's the one I've already started. And it said, no, you should read Desperation first because then The Regulators is easier to understand. However, I'm already just over 100 pages deep into The Regulators. However, once I kind of realised that Desperation, I should have read Desperation first because that sort of is like, as I understand it, is like the parallel universe to what's going on here. So I think once I could put that into context here, I actually did start to get into this more and it started to make more sense. So I intend to read Desperation when I finished this one. And I have actually started to really enjoy this one now that I'm kind of aware that there's a setup going on in another book. It makes a bit more sense what I'm reading. And then I think after I've actually read Desperation, then this book will probably make even more sense. But yeah, I am enjoying this so far, but I can't really obviously review it because I haven't finished it. And I wouldn't be comfortable reviewing this, I don't think, until I've actually read Desperation as well. And then I'd like to review the two together. So I'm probably going to finish this one off by the end of the week. And then hopefully I can finish Desperation before I catch up next Friday. And I can actually talk about both those books and how they work together. And, if I will regret reading The Regulators first, I'll let you know. But again, in the comments down below, let me know if you've read The Regulators and Desperation and which order that you did it in. So yeah. So I would say that so far, the opening to Kay's May has been pretty good. Yes, I've had a book that I have rated the lowest that I've ever rated a book this year. In fact, I think it's the lowest, apart from the DNFs that I've had on this channel, I think this might be the lowest I've actually rated a book since starting this channel. I'm normally quite positive about the things I read, and I don't believe in withholding fives just for the sake of it. I think if a book is like absolutely so outstanding that I've got to go and buy everybody that I know a copy, then that's worth more than a 5-star as far as I'm concerned. That's like a 10-star. But yeah, it takes a lot to bring a book down under the 2.5 mark for me. But regardless of that, I've also managed to get a 5-star out of this last week, so I'm really grateful for that. And I've also managed to get into another Stephen King novel, so I'm really grateful for that as well. So let me know in the comments down below what you've been reading this week, and if you've got any authors that have K in their forename or surname that you would recommend to me reading their book. As you can see, I've got a few out here at the moment. I do have loads more on my shelves. These are just the ones I get out this week to pick from, so that pile might change slightly as we go through the month. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more of my content, please press the subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you next Friday. Thanks for watching. Bye!